Good afternoon, and it is time, at least it's afternoon here. Don't know what time it is where you are, but it is time to go over the Chapter 9 key questions. So, the first key question for the chapter: what economic challenges did the new nation face after the Revolutionary War? Well, a lot of their economic challenges had to do with managing the currency, the fact that each state had their own individual currency. Also, they were busy competing with one another, and so without that cooperation and collaboration among states, it's quite a divided country. The biggest example I use is New York kind of bullying New Jersey, which we'll get into in the next couple chapters. Some other economic challenges came from nations like Britain, who dumped their manufactured items for very cheap prices in America, and that ruined any American businessmen who were hoping to start their own manufacturing businesses. When you expand that also to the idea of the British and French and others harassing our shipping over the next couple decades, well, those are some major economic issues as well. Number two, describe the flaws and challenges of the Articles of Confederation. The two major challenges that we discussed in class. Number one is their inability to collect taxes. First of all, the taxes had to be voluntary. States decided how much they handed in, and so oftentimes the government did not get to collect anything from those states. You also think of the idea of Shays' Rebellion, where they were able to push back because they couldn't pay their taxes, and that showed how weak the government was, which we'll get to in just a second. So collecting taxes is your first issue. They also had an inability to control the commerce between the states. States were not collaborating. States did not have the same currency. States simply did not cooperate. We had 13 independent states in America that weren't much of a united nation. And so without being able to handle those things, the nation faced a lot of issues. A couple more things to touch on is just the articles themselves. It took a unanimous vote to amend the articles. It had no executive branch. It just overall was not able to handle the nation as a whole. Letter B for number two, describe the successes of the Articles of Confederation. Westward expansion. The Land Ordinance Act of 1785 and the Northwest Land Ordinance of 1787. Both of those organized our westward expansion. Both of those managed how those territories would be created. It also sold land for education. The Northwest Land Ordinance even banned slavery, which is a very forward-looking idea at the time. And so westward expansion was handled greatly by the Articles of Confederation. That's really the only success to mention there. Number three, what international challenges did America face in its early years? First, Britain. Britain did not remove their soldiers from the frontier, from those forts. Britain did not respect our shipping. Britain impressed our sailors and harassed our shipping. They also enforced navigation acts, which restricted who we could trade with. You have France. France simply abandoned us as an ally and left us to the British to do what they will. And then you have the Spanish, who also, much like the British, supported raids against us with the Indians, and they shut off the New Orleans port from farmers at the mouth of the Mississippi River. So internationally, we face a lot of challenges. One last one would be the Barbary pirates in North Africa. Without the ability to create our own navy, we could not even protect our own shipping against small groups of pirates in the Mediterranean Sea. So what caused Shays' Rebellion? First of all, you could say taxes. They were farmers who could not pay their taxes. When they had their homes foreclosed upon, they were upset. And so they went about shutting down the judicial system in Massachusetts in order to get their way, to change the taxation and to keep their land. How did it end? Well, the federal government could not handle it, and so state militia had to be called in, a state-funded militia. And that showed that our federal government was unable to handle even the small mob uprisings like that of Daniel Shays and his group of farmers. Number five, explain the reasoning for national leaders to call the Constitutional Convention. And how is the convention different than its stated purpose? Well, men like Alexander Hamilton, who came together at the Annapolis Convention to discuss our commerce issues, recognized that our economy was never going to be highly functioning and that we would not be able to make as much money as we could if the government was able to protect its shippers and make the states cooperate and even collect taxes. So they wanted to call a meeting to discuss how we could amend the articles to make it better for everyone, especially as it pertained to commerce. How is the convention different? Well, rather than altering the Articles of Confederation, instead they created a brand new government, which I reference as a potential second revolution, if you want to call it that. Number six, describe the following compromises that forged the Constitution. First, you have the Great Compromise. This is also called the Small and Large State Compromise Plan. Small states wanted equal representation in Congress. because they knew that they could be pushed around by those who had a larger population, like they had under the Articles. Meanwhile, larger states wanted it based upon population because reasonably they had more people, so they believed they deserved greater control over how things were done in the House. This led to the creation of a bicameral legislature. Today we have the Senate, which is equal representation, and the House of Representatives, which is chosen based upon a state's population. And so that compromise, the creation of a two-house Congress, was able to make the large and small states agree. Then you have the three-fifths compromise. This has to do with what should slaves count for voting purposes and representation. Northerners argued that they should not count as a full person. Southerners argued, of course, they should count as a full person. This would give the South a large advantage that what they called their own property in their own land would give them a massive boost in numbers in the voting polls and representation. So the compromise was that slaves would only count 3/5 of a person for representation purposes. Number 7, what people and ideas made up the Federalists? Federalists would have been your elites, your merchants, your lawyers, those who were in the political sphere. They would have been living on the coast primarily. They supported a strong central government. They feared the phrase I kept using was mobocracy, is what they were afraid of. Then what people and ideas made up the anti-Federalists? Well, these people would have been probably frontiersmen. They would have been primarily farmers. They would not be your coastal elite. Instead, they would be living inland. They also believed in the ideas of the rights of man. And one fear that they had was the Bill of Rights and the fact that the Constitution did not allow for any of the rights to be protected from the federal government. Which transitions into number 8. How did the Federalists overcome the Anti-Federalists? For some of the states, it took the promise of the creation of a Bill of Rights and the promise of the addition of 10 amendments to the Constitution, what would become 10 amendments, that would protect our rights as people and as citizens from the federal government. So that promise won over a lot of other people. Federalists also won them over because it only required 9 of the 13 states to pass the Constitution as the official new document in order to start the new country, meaning that the 4 states left behind, which ended up being Virginia, New York, North Carolina, and Rhode Island, they would be outside of the official United States once the Constitution went into action. This convinced a couple states, along with the promise of the Bill of Rights, to vote yes on the Constitution and create a new country. Number 9, how did the idea of separation of church and state begin? The idea is pushed by Thomas Jefferson in Virginia. One of the 3 things on his gravestone is that he created the Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom. That was not the idea of you can't pray in church and you can't talk about your religion openly. Rather, it was that your tax money would not go to benefit or to fund a specific branch of the church or a specific set of faith. And so the separation of church and state began through Thomas Jefferson's effort in Virginia. And by the early 1830s, although it took a long time in New England, by the 1830s, no states had a state-funded church. Number 10, how did the new nation handle the equality of slaves? Not very well. The Constitution itself did not did not name slavery specifically. It's almost as though they were ashamed of it, is what I said in class. As far as how they handled it, some northern states granted gradual emancipation, where over time they would gain their freedom. Some groups like Pennsylvania Quakers pushed for full emancipation. Their battle lasted for a very long time, obviously, until the Civil War. But for the most part, the new nation handled slavery or the issue and equality of slaves by avoiding it. They knew that the issue could divide the country, and a divided country would not be a country at all. And so those who opposed it tolerated it and did not fight for its end in order to have a nation. Number 11, what was Republican motherhood? Well, Republican motherhood was the idea that women, their role in the new country would be to instill virtue and to instill great morals in our next generation so that we could have a republic that was full of virtue and the common interest would be put above our own self-interests. So women were relegated to the home and the idea that their motherhood would be the future of the republic. The influence of Abigail Adams. Abigail Adams was an influential figure who tried to convince her husband, John Adams, and other men like him and around him to remember women as they were creating the new documents of the government, like the Constitution. While they are left out, Abigail Adams is considered one of the early women leaders who pushed for their equality and inclusion in America beyond the home and even in the political sphere. Judith Sargent Murray stands out. You could almost call her one of our first feminists because she said the only reason that the genders or sexes are not equal, she wrote a pamphlet called Equality of the Sexes, the only reason that occurs is because women are not given equal education. Women at a certain age no longer learn about math or science and instead were forced to learn about sewing, or as she said, the mechanics of a pudding. So cooking and cleaning and housekeeping and child rearing were what they were trained in, while men were given further knowledge on science and politics and history and math. So that's that difference of equality in education, Judith Sargent Murray argued, that led to the difference in equality between men and women. So they both challenged, Abigail Adams and Judith Sargent Murray in their own way, challenged women's role in Republican motherhood, declaring that they wanted a more equal role. So that is Chapter 9, Key Questions. I hope that this helped. I hope this helps on the quiz tomorrow. Be sure you click like and subscribe because that's what people do on YouTube. They beg for your attention and love, and I suppose that I am no different. See ya.